Hey guys, so Prof McKnight requested something a while back, and as soon as I saw it, I decided to save it for a day like today, which is Veterans Day in the States. Um, I served 6 years in the military from 2002 to 2008, and I when I was going through it, it was terrible because there was a lot of sacrifices to make in there. I didn't. There were holidays that are kind of family important holidays that I never had. I remember one year. Um, like the year before I got out, I was sitting down at a table, and my Thanksgiving was a turkey sandwich, and that was pretty much it. And I went out for guard duty later that night, and I was standing at the end of a pier, and I was just sitting there, just looking out. It was nighttime, and my family. That was when they were going to get together and have Thanksgiving and everything like that. That is the bad thing about it was cold. It was actually raining, and it was below freezing, and I'm just standing out there cold, miserable, and I knew that a few states away my family was sitting down to Thanksgiving, and they left a chair open for me. In fact, the first time I ever got to spend that holiday with my family again, it was a really emotional time because I hadn't done that. I hadn't been able to do that since, you know, for 6 years. And then all of a sudden, there I was, and it was like I had never left. And it was really bizarre because at that point I was only 25 years old, so a quarter of my life had a little over a quarter of my life had passed, and for 6 years I hadn't sat down at that table on that day, and it was kind of a different day for me, and my brother actually had to explain it to my father because my father didn't understand, and he was just happy to have me home. He didn't understand why I was a wreck and I was trying to get through the meal. But the difference a year can make is vast, and I know that there's a lot of guys with stories out there, a lot of guys and gals with stories out there that of missing things because of military service, missing time with their families, missing important days. Uh, I remember one guy. It was just so bizarre because he just he had been in the military for 15 years, and he had never been home for his son's birthday, not even once. And his son was turning 16 years old, and I remember he was going to be home for that, and it was all he could talk about all week is the fact that he was going to be home for his son's birthday. It was all he could talk about all week, and it's all he wanted to talk about all week. Eventually, you just had to turn to him and tell him, "Shut up. We get it. You're going to be there for your kid's birthday. We get it." Um, and that's not including anything about war or deployments or the years that sometimes that are required to be away and the relationships that fall apart, and there's a lot of things that for me, I don't really think about it, not much anymore, as far as things that I didn't get a chance to experience or didn't have the opportunity to experience because of all the other things I experienced. I mean, I have stories for days, and sometimes I feel like talking. Sometimes I feel like telling them like interesting things that I did, places I saw, and but there's also all the bad things that went along with it. Uh, Anyhow, this is the fallen of World War II, and I've been holding on to this video ever since I saw it pop up for today. Like I said, it was requested by Prof McKnight. The numbers in here are going to be staggering, and this is the one thing that I'm always worried about. Because back then, that was the last absolute total war that we engaged in, and the numbers are just they're staggering, and even more horrific part about that is if we ever went back to that, if we ever went back to total war with the weapons that we have now, not nuclear weapons, just the conventional weapons we have right now, and it was like it was back then, because we use morality of these days to talk about actions of like what happened in the past. If we truly took the gloves off with each other like we did back then, the number of casualties would be beyond the scope of anything that we've ever seen. I hope to God we never wind up in that situation again. In any case, we're going to watch this. And, yeah, I already know certain numbers are going to be just mind-blowing. It depends on the source. Here we go.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors.
Right.
We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life.
This is going to be a horror story to even watch.
Whereas military deaths
like this
were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who are injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries,
yes,
and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war.
Yep.
The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy.
Yep.
One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
Yep.
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths.
Jesus.
The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides. But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Yep.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front.
Here comes the big numbers.
Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return.
Be careful. I say this as someone who just no. Be careful at any point of anything like this ever happening in the future. Ever. Under any circumstance. Don't listen to people that push for war just because, or start rattling the saber for war, because their kids aren't going to be the ones that are freezing to death, or like that guy, like that kid on the left here, and their kids aren't going to be the one holding the gun like that kid to the right, because both of them are under the age of 25. I think both of them are beneath the age of 20. Their kids aren't going to be the ones out there like this.
POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Yep.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
Good God.
But winning the war came at a cost.
What a difference a graph can make. Because you see these numbers, our numbers, our heads don't even think about Jesus. Our heads don't even think about numbers like this. We don't even think about numbers like this. You say it and it just goes
8.7 million
right out.
is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number.
There is.
Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
Yeah,
to complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this.
Oh my God.
You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
This is going to be a brutal number. This is going to be an absolutely brutal number. I already knew most of these numbers, but seeing them like this it has a different impact. And this is an amazing video for this. This has a different impact. Everybody that's sitting there slamming the horn for war at any opportunity, saying that we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to bomb here, we need to bomb here, or something like that. When we can handle it diplomatically, they need to be sat down and shown this.
6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps.
Jesus.
Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
These numbers are going to be absolutely nightmarish.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed.
There might have been a lot
About
more.
250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country.
I didn't
But
know
not
that.
the highest in total death count.
No, that
The
would be
Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million.
Probably higher.
A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg.
The siege of Leningrad is one of the, like, okay, there's a few battles in World War II. There's a few, I'm not even going to call them battles. There's a few cities in World War II that were utterly and totally just obliterated. Of course, you have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You have Nanking in China. You have Leningrad, Stalingrad, Dresden. Yeah, the list goes on and on.
German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies,
They
including
starved
food,
them.
cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers.
Largely.
He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities,
Nope.
thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag.
Yep.
Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States.
Yep.
The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude,
Yes.
causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
Don't ever listen to anybody that tries to draw you into some crap like this again. I've seen some of the, there's one video that's just one of the most horrible things that I've seen is this a bunch of Russian soldiers basically taunting a German woman who is walking down the street, and you find out what had happened to her prior to that, and it's just utterly sickening. And yeah, don't ever listen to anybody that tries to pull you into some stupid crap like, we need to go to war, we need to do this, and war has to be the absolute and utter last resort. It has to be.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater.
Jesus.
Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
Yep.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the
Compared, no. I think, aside from the fact that the Nazi war crimes were targeted towards the Jewish population, the Nazis were monstrous. The Japanese were on the same level, if not worse, because and the sheer fact that I'm saying that should let you know something, because if you've ever read any of the accounts of certain war crimes that were committed, just horrific to even contemplate having that kind of mindset toward another group on the Nazi side of the ball. But I can't even begin to think of what was going on in the minds of the Japanese military when they were committing some of the atrocities they committed, because those read out like, oh God, I'm not even.
Cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people.
Oh yeah, they did.
Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers.
Yep.
Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations.
They were.
Not military targets.
They were. The rationale behind it is because they had to break the fighting will of Japan. And once again, I'm not going to say it again. Jesus.
When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included.
Right.
More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry.
Right.
Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list.
Massively.
If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this.
Jesus.
This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
Now that's the Mao and Stalin numbers. Those are low compared to some of the other numbers I've seen.
When we turn to post-war
But they're
conflicts,
comfortable.
it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War.
Right.
25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary.
Right.
When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this.
All over the place.
They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq. But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced.
Yep.
Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths.
Right.
But those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs.
Right.
Or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
This was extremely good. This was an extremely good video. Okay. It is my personal belief that war needs to be at an absolute last possible resort. And the reason behind that is because, like, before World War I, one of the worst wars before World War II, the worst war that we had in Europe was World War I, which they called the war to end all wars. And the only reason everybody got into that was because of a just string of alliances that had been put in place long before. And when that kicked off, when that ended, the vengeance of the rest of Europe against primarily Germany, even though Germany's not even the one that kicked the whole thing off, was staggering. And the only thing the Treaty of Versailles did was ensure that World War II was going to happen. It just would have varied by severity based off who came into power, because the situation in Germany wasn't going to last. Be careful who you listen to is the biggest takeaway from this as far as I'm concerned. Be careful who you support and watch the rhetoric they're spewing. If they're talking about, oh, we have to, their kids aren't going to be over there. I mean, their kids aren't going to be doing that. Their friends aren't going to be over there. They aren't going to be over there. You, on the other hand, might very well be. Guys, I used to say this quite a bit, and I'm going to say it now. Take care of yourselves, and be good to each other. At the end, that's all we got. And as far as everything else goes, this was an excellent recommendation. Prof, this was outstanding. Thank you for recommending this. I'm going to be putting all the links to this, and this was made in 2016, which is amazing to me, that I haven't seen this before. But yeah, I'm going to call it with this. And guys, I'm going to be putting all of the creators' links in the description down below, so be sure to go give them like and subscribe if you like this video. Like and subscribe this video if you guys enjoy that. I'm going to be getting back to my regular, ridiculous, stupid content where I watch people do stupid things, talk about SCPs, 40K, all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to watch this on Veterans Day. Yeah. My link's going to be in the description down below, as well as my Patreon, PayPal, and the Discord, so you guys can come in and request videos that you guys want to see. In any case, that's it, guys. Treat each other well, and I'll catch you guys next time. And now it's time to have a boomer moment when I turn this thing off.